A police mistake, or was it? When a small-town cop arrests a black woman on false charges thinking she's just another face in the crowd, they have no idea who they've actually put in cuffs. Because she isn't just any woman, she's their commanding officer. And what happens next? It's more than just a fight to clear her name. It's a war against a corrupt system that's been stealing from her community for years. Lies, betrayal, public humiliation, every move designed to break her. But what they don't see coming is that she's already one step ahead. So buckle up, because this isn't just about one woman's reputation, it's about power, politics, and the high price of standing your ground. And trust me, you won't believe how far this goes until we dive in. Let us know what time you're listening and where you're tuning in from. Drop a comment down below. We'd love to hear your thoughts. And don't forget to hit that like button and subscribe for more real stories that hit hard and stick with you long after the video ends. Bayfield, Alabama wasn't the kind of place that made national news. It was the kind of place where people locked their doors out of habit, not fear, and where the salt air carried the scent of shrimp boats and diesel long before the morning sun broke the horizon. On the surface, Bayfield looked like any other sleepy coastal town tucked between marshlands and the Gulf of Mexico, but beneath the pastel-painted shops and the tourist-friendly boardwalk, there was a history that ran deeper and darker than most outsiders would ever care to ask about. For Major Evelyn Sanders, though, that history wasn't something she could afford to ignore because it lived in every corner of the job she had spent 22 years fighting to keep clean. At 45, Evelyn had learned that power in a place like Bayfield didn't always wear a uniform or sit behind a badge. Sometimes it wore a smile that never reached the eyes, a handshake that felt a little too firm, or a campaign button pinned to the chest of a man who claimed he wanted what was best for the town. She had shaken enough of those hands to know the difference between a promise and a trap. That's what had brought her to the fish market that Friday morning, unarmed, out of uniform, and moving like a shadow through the narrow alleys between rusted ice chests and crates of fresh catch still slick with seawater. The market was alive with the sounds of everyday life, fishermen shouting prices, knives scraping against wood as they cleaned their haul, the distant hum of a gospel station playing through a tinny radio perched on a counter. Evelyn walked past them, all her steps steady but light, her breath slow, as she scanned the crowd for a familiar face she had only seen once before in a blurry surveillance photo. Dale Bricker's nephew Johnny was supposed to make a drop that morning, an envelope passed from one hand to another, evidence Evelyn had spent months trying to get close enough to grab. She adjusted the bill of her cap lower over her short, tightly curled hair, pulling the sleeves of her old sweatshirt down over her hands, knowing she looked like just another woman out running errands before the heat of the day set in. Her heart was steady, her mind sharp, every instinct, reminding her that if she played this right, she could finally expose the network of property seizures and fake auctions that had robbed half a dozen black families of their land over the past 2 years. She'd seen the paperwork, heard the whispers, but what she needed was undeniable proof, and that proof was walking through the market at any moment. Evelyn moved toward the corner near Henderson's bait shop, where the smell of old shrimp shells and motor oil hung thick in the air. She leaned against the side of a rusted Coca-Cola cooler, tucking her hands into her pockets, as if she were waiting for someone who was already running late. She kept her head down, but her eyes never stopped moving, tracking every motion in the crowded walkway, until she saw him, tall, wiry, wearing a Bayfield high baseball cap and a jacket too heavy for the spring air. He moved with the twitchy energy of a man who knew he didn't belong, glancing over his shoulder every few steps as he edged toward a vendor selling bootleg cigarettes from the back of a pickup truck. She waited for the handoff, counting the seconds in her head, ready to signal her team the moment it happened. But before she could shift her weight to move, she heard a voice behind her, sharp, flat, and laced with that brittle kind of authority that didn't bother checking if it belonged there. "Hey, you, what do you think you're doing standing around back here?" Evelyn turned slowly, keeping her posture relaxed, already knowing who she was going to see before she even looked. Officer Tiffany Malone stood 5 feet away, hand resting on the butt of her service pistol like it was a nervous habit she couldn't break. Tiffany's blonde hair was pulled back into a high, severe ponytail, her lips pressed into a thin, unimpressed line. She looked Evelyn up and down like she was measuring a problem she'd already decided how to solve. Evelyn took a breath, weighing her options in the half-second of silence between them. She could pull rank, flash her badge number, call for backup, but doing any of that here in front of this, many people would blow the entire operation. So instead she raised both hands slowly, palms out, and answered with the calm she'd learned to wear like armor. "Just waiting on a friend." she said evenly, not moving an inch. Tiffany tilted her head, taking a step closer, her boots crunching on the gravel. "You got ID on you?" she asked, already knowing the answer. Evelyn had left her badge and her wallet locked in an unmarked car 3 blocks away, just like protocol required when working a live sting. She didn't flinch, didn't blink, just answered honestly. "Not on me. I'm working." Tiffany snorted, shaking her head like she'd heard the punchline of a joke, only she understood. "Yeah, right," she muttered under her breath, loud enough for the 2 older white men standing by the oyster stall to hear. They turned, watching now, their faces pinching with that familiar look Evelyn had seen too many times before, curiosity laced with suspicion. Tiffany took another step close enough now that Evelyn could see the sweat starting to bead on her upper lip, the slight tremble in her fingers as she tightened her grip on her belt. "I said, show me some ID, or you're coming with me." Evelyn's jaw clenched, but her voice stayed level, quieter, this time meant only for Tiffany's ears. "Tiffany, it's Evelyn, Major Sanders, your commanding officer." She let the words hang in the air between them like a lit fuse, watching for even the slightest flicker of recognition. But Tiffany just laughed, short, bitter, and mean. "Nice try," she sneered, reaching for her handcuffs like she'd already made up her mind. "Turn around." For a split second, Evelyn thought about running. She could outrun Tiffany easy. She could disappear into the alley behind the bait shop, circle back, and finish what she came here to do. But if she ran, the story would write itself before she even made it out of sight. The headlines would be brutal. The damage would be done. So she exhaled slowly, lowering her hands, and turned. The cuffs bit into her wrists with a familiar cold snap, tighter than they needed to be, as Tiffany yanked her arms behind her back and shoved her toward the center of the market. Heads turned, phones came out. People started whispering in that way they always did when they saw a black woman being marched through a crowd in cuffs. Evelyn kept her head high, her eyes forward, even as Tiffany's voice rang out over the hum of the market like a gunshot. "We've got a suspected dealer here," she announced loudly, dragging Evelyn toward the patrol car parked half on the sidewalk. "Should have known better than to show your face around here." Evelyn didn't say a word. She didn't give Tiffany the satisfaction of a reaction. She just let herself be pushed into the back seat, her heart pounding not from fear, but from something colder, heavier, something that settled deep in her gut like a stone. Because in that moment, as the door slammed shut and the market disappeared behind the tinted glass, Evelyn Sanders knew something with a clarity that made her chest ache. This wasn't just a mistake, it was something much worse. And before it was over, someone was going to make sure she paid for it. The ride back to the station felt longer than it had any right to be, even though Evelyn knew every crack in those streets by heart. She sat in the back of the patrol car, hands cuffed tighter than necessary, her wrists already beginning to throb beneath the metal. The windows were rolled up, trapping the stale air inside, mixing the faint scent of vinyl with the sharper bite of sweat and frustration. Officer Tiffany Malone didn't say a word as she drove her knuckles white around the steering wheel, her jaw clenched so tight it looked like it might shatter if she dared to open her mouth. Evelyn leaned her head back against the seat, closing her eyes for a moment, not to rest, but to try and quiet the slow, burning anger building behind her ribs. It wasn't the arrest itself that weighed the heaviest on her, not yet anyway. It was the look in Tiffany's eyes back at the market. That look wasn't confusion. It wasn't uncertainty. It was a choice. A deliberate, razor-sharp choice to humiliate her in front of strangers, in front of cameras, in front of the very community Evelyn had spent her life trying to protect. When the car finally jerked to a stop outside the Bayfield Police Department, Evelyn opened her eyes and let out a breath she hadn't realized she'd been holding. The building looked smaller than she remembered, as if the years had somehow shrunk it down to match the narrow-minded people who now ran it. Tiffany yanked the door open and grabbed Evelyn's arm with more force than necessary, dragging her out like a prize she couldn't wait to show off. Evelyn kept her feet steady, her posture tall, refusing to give Tiffany the satisfaction of seeing her stumble. Inside the station buzzed with the usual hum of phones ringing and radios crackling, but the moment they stepped through the door, the noise seemed to dip just slightly, like someone had turned down the volume in a room full of people trying not to stare. Evelyn felt the weight of every eye in the building as they passed, some curious, some wide with disbelief, and a few she knew filled with the kind of quiet satisfaction that made her skin crawl. Tiffany marched her toward the booking desk, her voice loud enough to turn every head within earshot. "Picked her up near Henderson's," she announced, dropping Evelyn's phone onto the counter like it was evidence of a crime. "No, ID. Acting suspicious. Possible connection to the street-level drug activity we've been monitoring near the docks. Evelyn swallowed hard, forcing herself to stay silent as the desk sergeant, an older man named Doyle, who had served under her for almost a decade, glanced up from his paperwork. His eyes widened, slightly recognition flickering across his face like a light bulb about to burn out. He opened his mouth as if to say something, but Tiffany leaned in before he could speak, lowering her voice just enough to shut him down, without making it obvious to the rest of the room. "You got a problem, Sergeant?" she asked, her tone dripping with the kind of false professionalism Evelyn had heard 100 times before. Doyle blinked, swallowed, and looked back down at his clipboard, his pen trembling slightly in his hand. "No, ma'am," he muttered, not meeting Evelyn's eyes. The sting of that silence cut deeper than any insult. Evelyn knew Doyle wasn't the enemy, not really, but fear was a powerful thing, and Tiffany wore it like armor. The desk sergeant finished the paperwork with mechanical efficiency, his shoulders hunched as if the weight of his own complicity had finally settled on his back. Evelyn was escorted to a holding cell without another word. The door clanged shut behind her, the sound bouncing off the concrete walls like a slap to the face. She sank onto the hard metal bench, her wrists still cuffed in front of her, and stared at the floor as the air around her thickened with the unmistakable scent of bleach and stale coffee. Time stretched out in long, brittle threads, as the minutes ticked by each second, pressing harder against her chest like a stone she couldn't move. Her mind spun through every option she had left, running over protocol, searching for a thread she could pull to stop this before it spiraled any further. She thought about calling Captain Price, but she already knew how that would go. Walter Price wasn't a bad man, but he was a man who liked things quiet, neat, and out of sight. He wouldn't risk sticking his neck out unless he knew the outcome before the first word left his mouth. Evelyn leaned forward, resting her elbows on her knees, pressing her cuffed hands together like a silent prayer she couldn't quite finish. She thought about the team she had built, the investigations she had risked everything for, and the community that had trusted her to fight battles they couldn't fight on their own. She had spent 2 decades building a reputation that stretched beyond the badge she wore, and now in a single morning that reputation was being shredded by the careless pride of a woman who couldn't see past her own reflection. Outside the cell, the sound of boots on tile grew louder, sharper, until Tiffany's voice broke through the hum like nails on glass. "I want her printed and processed now," she barked, her words slicing through the air like a blade. "She doesn't get a pass just because she says she's someone she's not." Evelyn's chest tightened, the anger burning hotter now, not just for herself, but for every person who had ever been dragged through these doors, on nothing more than a hunch and a lie. She stood slowly, her breath steady, and walked to the bars, locking eyes with Tiffany as she approached. "You really think this is how you win?" Evelyn asked quietly, her voice steady but sharp enough to make Tiffany's smirk falter for just a split second. Tiffany leaned in, close, her breath warm and sour on the other side of the bars. "It's not about winning," she whispered, her eyes cold and flat. "It's about knowing my place and reminding you of yours." Evelyn didn't flinch. She didn't blink. She just watched as Tiffany turned on her heel and walked away, leaving the air thick with the weight of something neither of them was willing to say out loud. And in that moment, standing alone in the dim light of that cell, Evelyn knew with unsettling clarity that this wasn't just about her anymore. It was bigger, heavier, something that had been building for years beneath the surface of every quiet conversation, every sidelong glance, every door that had closed just a little too quickly when she walked by. She leaned back against the cold wall, closed her eyes, and let the silence settle like dust on her skin, knowing deep down that whatever came next wasn't going to be clean, and it sure as hell wasn't going to be quiet. The hardest part wasn't the waiting. Evelyn Sanders had grown used to waiting long nights in stakeouts, silent hours in unmarked cars, weeks of careful planning that could fall apart in a single breath. No, the hardest part was knowing exactly who was going to walk through that door and realizing she already knew how the conversation was going to end before a single word was spoken. She didn't need a clock to tell her how long she'd been sitting there staring at the same spot on the far wall of that holding cell. The air had gone stale hours ago, thick with the lingering scent of bleach and old sweat, but she hadn't moved, not even once. When the door finally creaked open, it wasn't a relief. It was just another weight pressing down on her already heavy chest. Captain Walter Price stood there, filling the frame in that way. Only men like him seemed to do broad-shouldered, square-jawed, with that weary look in his eyes that told you he hated conflict, almost as much as he hated being dragged into someone else's mess. He didn't step inside. He didn't even bother closing the door behind him. He just stood there, arms crossed over his chest, as if putting a barrier between them would somehow keep him clean. "Evelyn," he said like her name tasted like vinegar in his mouth. She stood slowly, stretching the ache out of her knees, but she didn't move toward him. Not yet. She knew better. "Captain," she replied quietly, her voice steady but cold. "I assume you've seen the footage by now." He nodded once, slow and heavy, his jaw tightening as he shifted his weight from one foot to the other. "I've seen it," he muttered like he wished he hadn't. "Half the town's seen it by now. Hell, probably the whole damn state." Evelyn could feel the heat rise in her throat, but she swallowed it down, locking her hands behind her back out of habit more than necessity. "Then you know this is a mistake," she said, her voice sharp but not raised. "You know who I am. You know what I was doing out there." Price rubbed a hand over his face, dragging his palm down his jaw like he could somehow erase the moment just by wishing it away. "I know what you were supposed to be doing," he said slowly, carefully choosing every word. "But you were out there with no badge, no ID, and now the whole department's in the middle of a goddamn circus because Malone couldn't keep her mouth shut." Evelyn felt the words hit like a slap, but she held her ground. "So fix it," she replied, her tone sharper now. "You can clear this up in 5 minutes. Call it what it is, a bad arrest, a rookie mistake. Pull the report, shut down the rumors, and let me do my job." Price let out a breath that sounded more like a growl, stepping just far enough into the room that the door swung partially closed behind him. He lowered his voice, leaning in, as if the hallway itself might be listening. "You think this is about a report, Evelyn? This is bigger than that. I've got counsel breathing down my neck. I've got Bricker calling my phone every hour demanding answers. And I've got half the department whispering that you're the one who crossed the line, not her." For the first time since the cuffs had snapped around her wrists that morning, Evelyn felt something deeper than frustration settle in her chest, something heavier, something colder. "You believe that?" she asked, her voice barely a whisper. Price didn't answer right away. He just stood there, staring at her like a man standing on the edge of a cliff, knowing the ground was already crumbling beneath his boots. "I believe," he finally said, his voice slow and tired, "that even if I clear you today, they'll find another reason tomorrow. You've made enemies, Evelyn. Big ones. And they've been waiting for you to give them something to work with." Evelyn took a slow step forward, closing the distance between them until she could see the sweat beading at his hairline, the slight twitch at the corner of his eye. "You mean Bricker?" she said quietly, not as a question but as a statement she already knew the answer to. Price didn't deny it. He didn't have to. His silence was louder than any words he could have spoken. Evelyn let the truth settle between them like dust in a forgotten room. "I've been building this case for months," she said, her voice low but fierce. "Bricker Finnegan, the fake auctions, the property seizures, this town deserves to know the truth." Price shook his head, the weight of years pressing down on his shoulders. "This town doesn't want the truth, Evelyn," he whispered. "It wants the story that's easiest to believe. And right now that story is you standing in cuffs, looking exactly like they've been telling people you are all along." Evelyn felt her throat tighten, her breath catching in her chest like she'd just taken a punch she hadn't seen coming. She had known it was bad. She had known the fight was never going to be fair, but hearing it out loud from the man who was supposed to have her back hit harder than she could have prepared for. "So what now?" she asked softly, more to herself than to him. "You let them win." Price rubbed the back of his neck, glancing toward the hallway like he was looking for an exit that didn't exist. "I'm putting you on leave," he said finally, his voice cracking just a little at the edges. "Pending investigation." Evelyn felt the words land like a blade sliding between her ribs. "Suspension," she muttered, tasting the word like it was poison. "You're hanging me out to dry." Price didn't argue. He didn't apologize. He just turned toward the door, pausing with his hand on the frame, his voice so low she almost didn't hear it. "You should walk away, Evelyn," he whispered, "before they burn you for good." And with that, he walked out, leaving the door wide open behind him, the sound of the station buzzing back to life, like nothing had ever happened at all. Evelyn stood there for a long moment, staring at the empty space where he had been feeling the weight of every choice pressing down on her shoulders like a stone too heavy to lift. She could hear Tiffany laughing somewhere down the hall, the sound sharp and bitter like glass breaking in the dark. Evelyn didn't move. She didn't speak. She just stood there, her breath steady, her fists clenched at her sides, knowing that walking away might be the smart thing to do, but knowing deep in her bones that it was the one thing she could never bring herself to do. Because if she walked now, she knew exactly what would happen. They would erase her name, rewrite the story, and hang her picture on the wall as a warning to anyone who dared to stand where she had stood. And if there was one thing Evelyn Sanders knew with absolute certainty, it was this: she wasn't done fighting yet. The worst part about a small town isn't how fast word travels, it's how fast the truth gets buried. Evelyn knew that better than most. By the time she made it home that evening, the air had already shifted. It carried something heavier now, something meaner, like the whole town had leaned in to whisper behind closed doors the moment she'd stepped out of sight. She stood on the porch of her small brick house at the edge of Maplewood Heights, staring at the faint, spray-painted words on her garage door. 4 words, black and crude, dripping like fresh oil under the porch light. Leave while you can. She didn't need to check the cameras. She already knew they wouldn't show anything useful. Whoever had done it knew exactly where the blind spots were, exactly how far to stay from the motion lights. She ran a hand over the back of her neck, feeling the weight settle there like a stone. It wasn't the first time someone had tried to scare her off, and deep down she knew it wouldn't be the last. But this one felt different. This wasn't some kid with a can of spray paint. This was personal. Inside the house felt colder than it had when she left that morning. The silence pressed in around her, broken only by the hum of the refrigerator and the soft creak of the floor beneath her boots. She didn't bother turning on the lights. She just stood there in the dim glow of the street lamp outside, looking around like a stranger in her own home. Every shadow felt closer. Every creak felt louder. She locked the door behind her, turned the deadbolt twice, and leaned her back against the frame, closing her eyes for just a moment to gather what was left of her resolve. Her phone buzzed on the kitchen counter, one sharp vibration, then another. She opened her eyes slowly, pushing herself off the door like it took more energy than she had left. The screen lit up with a name she hadn't expected to see tonight: Reuben Ward. Former reporter, former friend, former pain in the department's side. She answered without thinking. "Reuben!" She breathed, her voice lower than usual, like the spray paint outside had somehow made her throat tighter. "You've seen it, haven't you?" His voice came through the speaker rough and fast, like he'd already had 3 cups of coffee too many. "The video's all over town. Bricker's spinning it like a damn hero story for Malone." Evelyn rubbed her temple, leaning against the counter, the cool laminate grounding her in the moment. "Yeah, I've seen it," she murmured, her eyes drifting toward the window like she expected someone to be standing there in the dark watching. Reuben let out a bitter laugh, the sound cracking like dry wood. "You know what they're saying? That you've been running a side hustle. That you've been using your badge to muscle people off their land for your own damn profit." Evelyn felt her jaw tighten, her free hand curling into a fist on the counter. "That's Bricker's play," she whispered, more to herself than to Reuben. "He's turning the whole town against me before I can finish what I started." There was a pause on the other end of the line. Then Reuben's voice dropped lower, softer, like he was leaning in close to make sure she heard every word. "I've been digging into the property records like you asked. Bricker's deeper in this than we thought. He's got Finnegan signing off on fake auctions, transferring titles through shell companies. The land never even hits the public listings. It goes straight to his back pocket." Evelyn's heart thudded once heavy and slow as she pressed her forehead against the cold edge of the cabinet. "You can prove it?" she asked quietly. Reuben let out a slow breath, the weight of years settling in his voice. "I can't prove it yet," he admitted. "But I'm close. Real close. I just need one more thread to pull." Evelyn closed her eyes, feeling the ache in her chest spread like wildfire. She'd known it was bad, but hearing it laid out like that made it feel worse, like the ground beneath her feet was crumbling faster than she could steady herself. "I'm not backing off," she said finally, her voice steady, even though every part of her felt like it was cracking apart. "Not now. Not after this." Reuben didn't try to talk her out of it. He knew better. "I'll keep digging," he promised. "But you'd better watch your back, Sanders. You're not just poking the bear anymore. You're kicking the whole damn hive." She hung up without saying goodbye, knowing full well that every word they spoke was probably already making its way to the wrong ears. She stood there for another minute, staring down at the phone in her hand, before slipping it into her pocket and grabbing her jacket from the back of the chair. She didn't bother changing out of her boots. She didn't bother locking the door behind her. She just walked out into the night like it owed her something. The streets felt smaller, somehow tighter, as if the whole town had leaned in just a little closer to watch her fall. She kept her head down as she made her way toward the only place she knew she could still move, without eyes pressing in from every window, back toward the docks, back toward the water, back toward the last thread she had left to pull. The pier stretched out in front of her empty, except for the soft lapping of waves against the wood, the faint creak of rusted chains swaying in the breeze. She stood at the edge, staring out at the dark water, her breath fogging in the cold air. Somewhere in the distance a seagull called out sharp and lonely, the sound carrying farther than it should have in the quiet. She closed her eyes just for a moment, letting the weight of everything settle on her shoulders. She could feel the choice pressing in around her, the weight of walking away, versus the firestorm waiting if she stayed. But there was never really a choice to make. Not for her. Not now. Evelyn Sanders turned away from the water, squared her shoulders, and started back toward the fight she knew was waiting. Not because she wanted to. Not because she believed she could still win, but because walking away would mean letting them write the ending without her, and she wasn't about to give them that. It was almost midnight when Evelyn found herself parked 3 blocks south of Jefferson Square, sitting in the dark behind the wheel of a borrowed sedan that smelled like burnt coffee and stale air freshener. She hadn't slept since the arrest, hadn't eaten anything but a granola bar she found stuffed in her glove box earlier that afternoon, and the weight pressing down on her chest felt heavier with every hour that passed. She stared at the glowing face of her phone, the tiny clock in the corner, ticking past 11:57, wondering not for the first time if she was already too late. The meeting with Ruben had taken longer than she planned, but it hadn't been wasted. He had laid it all out on the cracked plastic table in the back of the old boxing gym where he ran his freelance operation. Documents, property records, grainy photos of handshake deals taken through cracked window blinds, every thread of corruption laid bare between 2 cups of lukewarm coffee. But what hit the hardest wasn't the paperwork or the photos. It was the fear in Ruben's eyes when he leaned in, voice barely louder than a breath, and said, "They know you're coming, Evelyn, and they're already moving to shut you down." That was why she was here. Not at home, not sleeping, not hiding, because the only way to stop them was to get louder than they were willing to go, and she knew exactly who she needed to talk to first. She slipped out of the car, pulling the hood of her sweatshirt low over her head, her footsteps soft against the damp pavement as she moved toward the glow of the rusty Anchor, the last black-owned bar still standing in Bayfield, and the only place left where she knew people would actually listen. The air was thick with cigarette smoke and cheap whiskey by the time she pushed open the heavy door, the low hum of blues guitar bleeding out from an old jukebox in the corner. Every head in the room turned when they saw her, some with surprise, others with something that felt sharper, like quiet judgment hanging in the air. She didn't flinch. She didn't smile. She just walked toward the bar, planting her hands flat on the worn surface, locking eyes with the man behind it. Arthur "Pop" Davis had been running this place since long before Evelyn had worn her first badge. His face was lined with time, his hands steady as he wiped down a glass with the kind of focus that told her he already knew why she was here before she even opened her mouth. "Pop," she said softly, her voice rough from too many hours of silence. "I need your help." He didn't say anything right away. He just set the glass down carefully, leaned his elbows on the bar, and let out a long, heavy breath that seemed to carry the weight of every bad decision this town had ever made. "You've got the whole damn town on fire, Evelyn," he muttered, his eyes dark and tired. "And you think you're going to put it out with gasoline?" Evelyn swallowed hard, pushing past the ache rising in her throat. "I'm not here to put it out," she whispered. "I'm here to burn the rest of it down." Pop studied her for a long moment, the room falling so quiet she could hear the soft hum of the neon sign flickering in the window. Then, without another word, he straightened up and nodded toward the back room. "Go on," he said quietly. "They're waiting." Evelyn didn't have to ask who he meant. She walked toward the door, her heart pounding louder with every step. Inside, the air was thick with tension, the low murmur of voices cut off the moment she stepped through. Sitting around the table were 6 of the loudest, most stubborn community organizers in Bayfield, people she had known for years, people who had trusted her to fight for them when no one else would. She stood at the head of the table, her hands shaking just enough that she had to curl them into fists at her sides to make them stop. "You've all seen the footage," she began, her voice steady but low. "You've heard the lies. You know what they're trying to do." No one spoke. No one needed to. She could see it in their eyes, the fear, the anger, the exhaustion of people who had been fighting the same battle long before she ever put on a uniform. "They want you to believe I'm the problem," she continued, stepping closer, her breath quickening as the words finally started to come easier. "But I've got proof, real proof. Bricker, Finnegan, Malone, they're the ones who've been stealing from this town. They're the ones who've been selling us out while smiling in our faces." One of the organizers, a woman named Dee with fire in her voice and no patience for empty promises, leaned forward, folding her arms across her chest. "So what's the play, Sanders? You gonna go knock on the mayor's door and ask him to confess?" Evelyn let out a breathless, bitter laugh, shaking her head. "No," she whispered. "I'm gonna put the truth in front of every camera, every phone, every person willing to listen, and I need you to help me do it." The room went still, the weight of that request hanging heavy in the air. Then Dee leaned back in her chair, letting out a slow breath before nodding once. "All right," she said softly. "Let's make some noise." Evelyn felt something shift in her chest, then not relief exactly, but something like it. Something sharper. Something that felt like hope breaking through the cracks. She knew it wasn't going to be easy. She knew it wasn't going to be clean. But for the first time in days, she didn't feel like she was standing alone. They spent the next 2 hours planning every step. Who would handle the press? Who would organize the march? Who would make sure the story couldn't be buried before it had the chance to breathe? And when Evelyn finally stepped back out into the night, the air felt different, charged alive, like the whole town was holding its breath, waiting for something to give. She stood there on the sidewalk for a long moment, her breath fogging in the cool air, the weight of the fight pressing in all around her. And then, without looking back, she started walking toward her car, her steps steady, her mind clear. Because if they wanted a fight, they were damn sure about to get one. By the time the first light of dawn broke across the Bayfield skyline, the air felt like it had shifted again, thicker, somehow heavier, as if the whole town had spent the night holding its breath. Evelyn stood alone on her front porch, arms crossed over her chest, watching the empty street with eyes that hadn't seen sleep in nearly 36 hours. The spray-painted thread on her garage door had been scrubbed away with soap and bleach, but she knew better than to think the danger had been erased with it. If anything, she could feel it more now, close enough to taste, close enough to hear in the quiet that stretched just a little too long between passing cars. The rally had worked. By midnight, word had already started to spread. Flyers printed on cheap paper littered the sidewalks, social media flooded with photos of the protest signs being painted in living rooms and backyards. Justice for Sanders. Bayfield deserves the truth. Fire Malone now. People were choosing sides, and for once, Evelyn wasn't standing in the shadows alone. But that didn't mean she could afford to stop moving. She was halfway through her second cup of black coffee when Reuben called again, his voice lower, this time stretched thin, like something had worn him raw overnight. "We've got movement," he whispered, not bothering with small talk. "City Hall's got trucks loading up boxes, paperwork, hard drives, the whole 9 yards. Brickers scrubbing the place clean." Evelyn closed her eyes, pressing the heel of her hand against her temple, as if she could push back the slow rising burn behind her eyes. "Damn it!" she muttered, her voice rough. "Where's he moving it?" Reuben didn't answer right away. She could hear him breathing on the other end, could almost picture him pacing the floor of that tiny office of his, chain smoking like it was the only thing keeping his heart from seizing up. "Warehouse," he finally said. "East Side, down by the old cannery." Evelyn's stomach tightened, the weight of the word warehouse settling like a stone in her gut. She knew the place. Everyone in Bayfield did. It had been abandoned for years, just another rusted shell on the edge of town, long since forgotten by the tourists and developers. It was the kind of place people used when they didn't want to be seen. And she didn't need a map to know it was exactly the kind of place Bricker would use to bury the last traces of his dirty empire. "I'm going," she said quietly, already grabbing her jacket off the back of the chair. "Evelyn," Reuben hissed, his voice sharp, now laced with something that almost sounded like fear. "You can't go in there alone. You know they'll be waiting for you." She paused for just a breath, her fingers tightening around the phone. "Then I guess they won't be surprised when I show up," she whispered and hung up before he could argue. The warehouse sat like a dead thing on the edge of the Bayfield shoreline, its windows boarded up with warped plywood, its roof sagging in the middle like a broken spine. Evelyn parked 2 blocks away, slipping through the side streets with her hood pulled low, her breath clouding in the early morning chill. She could hear the distant clang of metal against concrete, the low rumble of truck engines idling just beyond the broken fence. She crouched behind a rusted shipping container, her heart pounding steady but hard in her chest. She could see them, 3 men, all wearing dark jackets, moving crates from the back of a city vehicle into the yawning mouth of the warehouse. One of them kept glancing over his shoulder, rubbing the back of his neck, like he could feel the weight of something watching. He was jumpy. Good. That meant they weren't as sure of themselves as they wanted to be. Evelyn edged closer, keeping to the shadows, her breath low and steady. She had her phone in one hand, already recording, the camera lens peeking out just over the rusted metal. She caught every face, every license plate, every box marked with the Bayfield City seal. But she needed more than footage. She needed sound names, orders, something she could tie to Bricker himself. And then she heard it, a voice cutting through the quiet, rough and familiar, laced with the kind of venom she'd recognize anywhere. "Hurry up!" Bricker snapped, stepping out from the shadows near the loading dock. "I want this place empty by noon. Finnegan's got the next round waiting at the courthouse, and I'm not losing a damn thing to that woman." Evelyn's heart stuttered, her breath catching in her throat. She shifted, leaning in closer, gripping her phone tighter as she caught every word. But in her rush to move, her foot scraped against a loose piece of gravel, the sound sharp and unforgiving in the cold morning air. Bricker's head snapped toward the sound, his eyes narrowing like a blade being drawn from its sheath. "Who's there?" he barked, already moving toward her. Evelyn ducked, cursing under her breath, shoving the phone deep into her pocket as she turned to run. But she wasn't fast enough. One of the men lunged from the side, catching her arm, twisting it behind her back, with more force than necessary. She bit back a cry, digging her boots into the dirt as she struggled to break free, but it was no use. Bricker stood over her a moment later, his breath hot against her ear as he leaned in close enough to make her skin crawl. "I told them you'd come," he whispered, his voice low and gleeful. "And you just made this easier for me." Evelyn didn't answer. She didn't flinch. She just stared at the ground, counting her breath, forcing herself to stay calm even as her heart pounded like a war drum in her chest, because she knew something Bricker didn't. The phone was still recording, and she'd already sent the first clip to Reuben before she ever stepped out of that car. They could grab her, they could threaten her, but they couldn't stop what had already started. And standing there, bruised and breathless, Evelyn Sanders felt something stir deep in her chest. Not fear, not defeat, but something colder, sharper, more dangerous than anything they could put their hands on. She smiled, just a little, and waited for her moment to strike back. The first thing Evelyn noticed when they pushed her through the doors of the precinct was how silent everything had become. The usual hum of radios, the scattered tapping of keyboards, the occasional ring of a desk phone, all of it had stopped, like someone had sucked the air out of the entire building. She kept her chin high, forcing her feet to move, even though every muscle in her body screamed at her to turn and run. But she knew better than anyone, there was no running left, not this time. Tiffany Malone stood waiting at the end of the hallway, leaning casually against the corner of the duty desk, like she had all the time in the world. Her lips curled into that same crooked smile Evelyn had seen on the pier, the kind of smile that made your skin itch long before you figured out why. Tiffany didn't say anything at first. She didn't have to. The look on her face said enough. "Bring her to holding," she ordered without even looking at the 2 officers flanking Evelyn, her voice sharp enough to slice through the tension hanging in the air. "And make sure she's nice and comfortable. We've got visitors coming." Evelyn didn't ask who. She didn't have to. She already knew what was coming. The cell door slammed shut behind her with a metallic clang that echoed off the concrete walls like a gunshot in an empty room. She pressed her back to the wall, sliding down slowly, until she was sitting on the cold, hard floor, her knees pulled up tight to her chest. The adrenaline had long since burned off, leaving nothing behind but the steady thump of her heartbeat in her ears and the taste of copper on the back of her tongue. She didn't know how long she sat there before the voices started to rise on the other side of the wall, low at first, then louder, until the words started to push through the cracks like smoke under a door. They were chanting her name, over and over again. Hundreds of voices swelling into one unstoppable roar that shook the very walls of the building. "Justice for Sanders! Justice for Sanders! Justice for Sanders!" Evelyn's throat tightened her fingers, curling into the fabric of her jeans as the sound pressed in from all sides. For a split second, she felt something close to hope, but hope she knew was a dangerous thing in Bayfield. And it didn't take long for the hammer to drop. The door flew open without warning, slamming against the cinder block with a crack that made her flinch before she could stop herself. Tiffany strolled in her badge glinting under the flickering light, her hand resting casually on her hip. "On your feet?" Tiffany barked, her voice sharper than before, laced with something that felt an awful lot like satisfaction. Evelyn pushed herself up slowly, refusing to let Tiffany see how much it hurt to stand. She could already feel the bruises blooming along her ribs, the dull ache in her shoulder, where one of Bricker's men had twisted her arm nearly out of its socket. But she stood anyway, tall and steady, her eyes locked on Tiffany's. Tiffany took a step closer, lowering her voice to a venomous whisper. "You've got a choice to make," she hissed. "You go out there quiet or we drag you out like a dog. Either way, you're walking through that front door in front of every damn camera in this town." Evelyn didn't blink. She didn't flinch. She just leaned in close enough that Tiffany had to step back, her voice low and steady. "You think this is the end?" she whispered. "You haven't even seen me start yet." Tiffany's jaw tightened, her knuckles whitening as she waved for the officers to open the door. The roar of the crowd hit like a wall of heat spilling into the hallway as they dragged Evelyn toward the front steps of the precinct. She could see the flashing lights before she even cleared the doorway. News vans lined up on both sides of the street, cameras trained on the entrance like vultures, waiting for a body to hit the ground. The crowd surged as soon as they saw her pushing against the barriers, with fists raised, their chants rising louder with every step she took. Evelyn felt her breath catch in her throat, her pulse pounding in her ears, as she locked eyes with Reuben near the front of the crowd, his face pale and tight, with something that looked a lot like fear. She didn't slow down. She didn't look away. She just kept moving until she was standing on the top step, the entire weight of Bayfield pressing in from all sides. For the first time since this started, she felt the ground shift beneath her feet, not against her, but with her. And that's when the first tear gas canister hit. The hiss was sharp and sudden, slicing through the air as the crowd erupted in panic. People scattered in all directions, coughing and choking as the white clouds rolled over them like a tidal wave. Evelyn's chest seized, her vision swimming, as she tried to turn back toward the door, but the officers behind her didn't move. They just stood there, unmoving, watching the chaos unfold like it was something they'd been waiting to see. "Get her off the steps!" someone shouted over the noise, but the words barely registered before the second canister hit, bouncing off the pavement near Reuben's feet. He doubled over, disappearing into the smoke as Evelyn fought to push through the line of officers blocking the door. She could feel hands grabbing her, pulling her back, dragging her down the steps as the world dissolved into shouting and smoke. She hit the ground hard, the impact rattling through her bones as her vision blurred with tears she couldn't blink away. And then, through the haze, she saw them. Bricker, Finnegan, and Tiffany, standing at the edge of the chaos, watching with cold, unflinching eyes, as if they had already written the ending and were just waiting for the credits to roll. Evelyn gritted her teeth, dragging herself up to her knees, coughing so hard it felt like her ribs might snap in two. She wiped her face with the back of her sleeve, tasting blood and smoke on her tongue, but she didn't stop moving. She couldn't stop, because standing still meant letting them win. And that was something Evelyn Sanders had never been willing to do. She pushed herself to her feet, fists clenched at her sides, her breath ragged but steady. The noise swirled around her, the crowd fighting to breathe, to stand, to push back against the weight pressing down on them. And in that moment, with the whole world burning around her, Evelyn made a choice. She raised both hands above her head, fingers spread wide, and turned to face the cameras still rolling in the distance. She didn't speak. She didn't shout. She just stood there, bloodied but unbroken, daring them to try and erase her again. It took 3 hours for the streets to quiet, but the smoke in Evelyn's throat felt like it would last a lifetime. She sat alone on the concrete floor of a borrowed safe house on the east side, her back pressed to the cool wall, knees bent to her chest, trying to slow the steady grinding rhythm of her breath. The skin under her eyes burned from the gas, her ribs ached from where boots and fists had found their mark in the confusion, and her head pounded like every nerve in her body had been stretched thin and left to snap under the weight of something she couldn't yet name. She hadn't said a word since they pulled her out of the crowd, not to Reuben, not to Marcus, not even to Pop, who had shown up at the edge of the barricades with a steel pipe tucked under his coat and murder in his eyes. They had tried to talk to her, tried to tell her she needed to rest, to regroup, to let the community take the fight from here. But she couldn't hear them, not really, because all she could hear was Bricker's voice from the warehouse still rattling around in her head like a loose bullet casing on a concrete floor. "I told them you'd come, and you just made this easier for me." Easier. That word stuck to her skin like oil she couldn't wash off. She knew what Bricker was doing, knew the game he had set in motion long before she ever showed up on that pier. But what she hadn't expected, what she hadn't prepared for, was how quickly the department had turned their back on her. One by one, officers she had trained, fought beside and bled with had stepped away, their silence louder than gunfire in a crowded room. It wasn't just Bricker anymore. It wasn't just Finnegan, or Malone, or the council. It was the whole damn machine grinding her into the ground with every slow, deliberate turn. And for the first time since this fight started, Evelyn felt something she wasn't ready to admit, not out loud, not even to herself. Doubt. The word made her stomach twist, but she felt it there, spreading through her chest like a slow poison. She didn't know if she could win anymore. She didn't even know if she could make it to morning without the weight of all this pulling her under. But just as she leaned her head back against the wall, ready to let that silence swallow, her phone buzzed once on the floor beside her. She didn't move at first. She just stared at the glowing screen, letting the sharp vibration cut through the quiet, like a single thread snapping in a room full of unraveling seams. And then finally she reached for it with a shaking hand, flipping it over to read the message. "Unknown number, we need to meet. Tonight. Old loading yard behind Fisherman's Point. Midnight. Come alone." She read it twice, her breath catching in her throat. It was stupid. It was reckless. It was the kind of thing they taught you to never fall for in basic training. But her gut told her something different. This wasn't a setup. This wasn't another trap. It felt personal. Too personal to ignore. She stood slowly, every muscle in her body screaming in protest as she grabbed her jacket from the back of the folding chair. She didn't bother telling anyone where she was going. She didn't leave a note. She didn't ask permission. She just slipped out the back door, the screen creaking on its hinges as she stepped into the night, her breath fogging in the damp air. The loading yard sat at the edge of the bay, tucked between two abandoned shrimp warehouses with broken windows and rusted siding that rattled in the breeze. The moon hung low in the sky, casting long, thin shadows across the cracked pavement. Evelyn kept her footsteps light, her pulse steady, her hands loose at her sides as she scanned the darkness for any sign of movement. And then she saw him. Standing under the busted floodlight near the far corner of the yard, his shoulders hunched, hands jammed deep into the pockets of a worn canvas jacket. Reuben. He looked older, somehow smaller than she remembered, like the weight of what they'd uncovered had shrunk him down to something less solid. She approached slowly, keeping her voice low. "You sent the message?" she asked, even though she already knew the answer. Reuben turned, his face pale in the moonlight, his jaw tight with something that looked a lot like guilt. "I tried to warn you," he whispered. "But it's bigger than you think. Bricker's not just cleaning house. He's already moved half the evidence out of state. Federal storage, private trucks. It's gone, Evelyn, or it will be by morning." She felt the words hit like a punch to the chest, knocking the air from her lungs. "How do you know?" she whispered, stepping closer. Reuben swallowed hard, his throat bobbing as he glanced over his shoulder like he expected someone to be standing there. "Because I got a tip from someone inside. Someone higher than Bricker. Someone pulling his strings." He paused, dragging a shaky hand through his hair. "They're using Malone to finish the job. Tonight." Evelyn's blood ran cold. "Where?" she asked, her voice sharper now, the fear twisting into something harder, something sharper. Reuben didn't answer right away. He just held out a small, battered recorder, the red light blinking faintly in the dark. "You need to hear it for yourself," he whispered, pressing it into her palm before turning to walk away, his shoulders shaking with something that looked a lot like defeat. Evelyn stood there for a long moment, staring down at the small device in her hand, the weight of it heavier than it had any right to be. She didn't press play, not yet. She didn't need to, because deep down she already knew what she was going to hear. And whatever it was going to change everything. Morning in Bayfield had never felt so loud. It wasn't the sound of traffic or the distant hum of shrimp boats leaving the harbor. It wasn't the creak of rusty signs swinging in the breeze or the occasional bark of a stray dog echoing down the empty side streets. No, this was something different. This was the kind of noise that settled deep in your chest, wrapping itself around your ribs and tightening with every breath. It was the sound of a town on the verge of breaking apart. Evelyn stood in the center of Jefferson Square, the faint buzz of her phone still vibrating in her pocket like a pulse she couldn't quiet. She could feel the crowd pressing in from all sides. Hundreds of faces turned toward the steps of City Hall, where a single microphone stood waiting. The sun hadn't even cleared the rooftops yet, but the air already carried the heavy scent of sweat and something sharper, like electricity, humming just beneath the surface. She had played the tape Reuben had given her twice. Every word had hit like a hammer, driving nails into a coffin she hadn't even realized they'd already built for her. Bricker's voice had been unmistakable, calm, cold, laughing softly as he laid out the final steps. Moving evidence out of state, framing Evelyn for obstruction, setting Malone up to finish the job under the cover of the night. Every piece of it had been planned, calculated, tied up in a neat little bow that was never meant to unravel. But it had, because Reuben had leaked the recording just after sunrise. By the time Evelyn had walked out her front door, the whole town had already heard it. She scanned the crowd now, her heart pounding in her throat as she caught sight of Reuben standing near the edge of the square, his face pale but steady. Marcus was there too, shoulder to shoulder with the same organizers who had filled the back room of the Rusty Anchor just 2 nights earlier. Dee stood at the front of the crowd, her fists clenched around a protest sign held high above her head. "We stand with Sanders." The words burned bright against the sea of bodies, packed tight against the metal barricades, louder than any chant, sharper than any headline. And then the doors to City Hall creaked open. Evelyn felt the world tilt for just a moment as Bricker stepped out onto the steps, flanked by Finnegan and 2 other council members who looked like they'd swallowed something bitter and couldn't quite spit it out. They didn't speak at first. They didn't need to. The cameras were already rolling, the microphones already live. Bricker raised his hands, palms out, that same practiced smile curling at the corners of his mouth. "Ladies and gentlemen," he began, his voice steady, almost warm. "I know there's been a lot of confusion these past few days, a lot of anger, a lot of pain, but I want you all to know that we hear you, we see you, and we are committed to restoring the peace in our community." Evelyn could feel the bile rising in her throat as the crowd began to shift, some people cheering, others booing, their voices tangling in the thick morning air like 2 storms colliding. She glanced at Marcus, who gave her the smallest of nods, barely there but enough. She took a step forward. "No more lies," a voice shouted from the crowd, and for a moment the square went quiet. Evelyn felt her throat tighten, but she kept moving, pushing through the line of people until she stood at the front just a few feet from the steps. Bricker's eyes flicked toward her, and for the first time that smile faltered, just a hairline crack in the armor he had worn so well for so long. Evelyn raised her voice steady and loud enough to carry. "You're done hiding," she called out, her breath catching in her chest. "They heard the tape. We all did. You lied to this town. You used your badge, your power to silence people who trusted you, but not anymore." The square erupted, the noise crashing down like a wave as the crowd surged forward, the barricades groaning under the pressure. Bricker raised his hands again, shouting something into the microphone, but the words were lost in the storm of voices rising around them. And then the sirens started. Black SUVs pulled up along the curb, their doors flying open as agents in dark suits poured out, moving fast, cutting through the chaos with practiced precision. Evelyn felt the air freeze in her lungs as they swarmed the steps, flanking Bricker, Finnegan, and the rest of the council. Bricker's face twisted, his mouth moving in silent protest as they cuffed his wrists behind his back and read him his rights. The crowd went silent just for a moment, the weight of what was happening sinking in like a stone dropped into deep water. Evelyn stood there, her breath shaking, her fists still clenched at her sides. She watched as Bricker was led down the steps, his face pale and tight with rage, his eyes locked on hers like he still believed there was a way out. But Evelyn didn't flinch. She didn't look away. She just stood her ground, feeling the ground settle beneath her feet for the first time in what felt like years. Marcus moved to her side, his hand resting on her shoulder, grounding her in the moment. "You did it!" he whispered, barely louder than a breath. Evelyn let out a slow, shaky exhale, her chest tightening as the weight of it all pressed down on her shoulders. "No," she whispered back, her voice low but certain. "We did." And just like that, the square erupted again, not in anger, not in fear, but in something louder, something sharper, something that felt like hope rising from the ashes. Evelyn closed her eyes just for a moment, letting the sound wash over her, filling the cracks that had formed inside her over the long, brutal fight. She didn't know what tomorrow would bring. She didn't know if the system that had tried so hard to crush her could ever really be trusted to change. But for the first time in a long time, she believed there might still be something left worth fighting for. And that was enough for now. The sun was already starting to slip behind the rooftops when Evelyn finally let herself slow down. The streets around Jefferson Square had begun to clear, the crowds thinning into smaller pockets of people hugging, crying, and standing shoulder to shoulder in quiet disbelief. It was strange standing here in the fading light, knowing that for the first time, in what felt like forever, the noise wasn't pressing down on her from every direction. The chanting had stopped, the sirens had gone silent, and the cameras for once had been turned off. Evelyn stood on the steps of City Hall, watching the last of the federal vehicles pull away, Bricker's face pressed tight against the window like a man already counting the years ahead of him. She didn't feel victorious. She didn't feel like she had won anything. All she felt was tired, bone-deep soul-tired in a way she couldn't remember ever feeling before. Marcus had tried to convince her to stay, to let the others carry her back to the precinct like some kind of hero returning from war. But Evelyn had seen enough parades in her lifetime to know how quickly people could turn their cheers into silence. She didn't need applause. She didn't need headlines. She just needed a moment to remember who she was before all this had started. So she slipped away quiet as a shadow, her boots crunching softly against the broken sidewalk as she made her way down toward the water. The air smelled of salt and gasoline, heavy with the scent of the bay pushing up against the shoreline like it had nowhere else to go. She walked without thinking, letting the ache in her legs and the weight in her chest carry her forward one slow step at a time. By the time she reached the old pier, the sky had turned a deep, soft blue, the first stars blinking faintly above the dark water. She stood at the edge, staring out over the waves, her hands shoved deep into the pockets of her jacket. The wood creaked beneath her feet every step, a reminder of how much had changed in so little time. She thought about everything they had lost, about the families Bricker had stolen from, about the people who had stood by and watched it happen, too scared or too tired to push back. She thought about the nights she had spent chasing shadows, about the choices that had brought her here, and the pieces of herself she had left behind along the way. Evelyn closed her eyes, drawing a long, steady breath, the salt air burning just a little as it filled her lungs. For the first time in days, there were no cameras, no reporters, no one waiting to twist her story into something it was never meant to be. It was just her and the water and the soft whisper of the wind tugging at the frayed edges of her sleeves. She didn't know what would come next. She didn't know if the department would ever really clean house, or if they would find new ways to paint over the cracks. She didn't know if the council would learn from this, or if they would go right back to protecting their own the second the cameras stopped rolling. But standing there in the fading light, Evelyn knew one thing for sure. She wasn't going back to the life she had before. She had turned down the promotion to chief earlier that afternoon, sliding the offer letter back across Captain Price's desk without saying a word. He hadn't argued. He hadn't tried to change her mind. He just nodded once, slow and heavy, like he had known all along she would walk away. She didn't do it out of pride. She didn't do it because she was bitter or broken or looking for a way to punish the department that had failed her. She did it because she knew she could do more standing outside those walls than she ever could from behind that desk. The title had never been the goal. The fight had always been bigger than that. Evelyn took one last breath, filling her lungs with the quiet she had earned, then turned away from the water, her boots scuffing softly against the worn wood of the pier. She could hear the city stirring behind her, the faint hum of life picking back up after the storm. And for the first time in a long time, she didn't feel like she was standing alone in the middle of it. She walked back toward the streetlights flickering on one by one as she passed. She knew there would be more fights ahead, more nights spent chasing truths that people didn't want to hear. But she also knew she wasn't the only one willing to stand in that gap anymore. And maybe that was enough. She stopped at the corner of Jefferson and Main, the soft glow of the rusty anchors spilling out onto the sidewalk like a promise waiting to be kept. She could hear the low hum of music floating through the open door, the sound wrapping around her like an old coat she hadn't worn in years. Evelyn leaned against the street lamp for a moment, tilting her head back to watch the stars flicker overhead, her breath curling soft and steady in the cool night air. And in that quiet, with the city still breathing around her, she let herself smile just a little. Not because it was over. Not because the fight had been won, but because for the first time in a long time she knew exactly who she was. And she wasn't going anywhere. You know, when you really step back and look at Evelyn's story, it's not just about corruption or politics. It's about the cost of standing up when it would be easier to sit down. It's about what happens when someone decides that protecting their community is more important than protecting their own comfort. And for a lot of us, especially those of us who've lived long enough to see how slow change can be, it's a reminder that sometimes the fight isn't about winning overnight. Sometimes it's about showing up again and again, even when you're tired, even when you're outnumbered, even when people tell you you're wasting your time. Evelyn didn't have a perfect ending. She didn't walk away with a medal or applause. But she walked away knowing she didn't let fear or power silence her. And maybe that's what real victory looks like, not changing the whole world all at once, but refusing to let the world change who you are. So if this story spoke to you, if it reminded you of a fight you've lived through or a truth you still carry, take a moment to hit that like button. Drop a comment below, we'd love to hear your thoughts. And don't forget to subscribe for more powerful stories just like this one. Your support helps keep these conversations alive.